They told you that prayer was nothing more than tradition, a rote recitation of hollow words, a ritual performed with bowed head and clasped hands, while your heart stayed dull and your voice stayed small. They instructed you to believe it was about humility, about submission, about begging a distant deity for permission to exist. They convinced you that you were weak, unworthy, dependent. You had to bow, you had to plead, you had to ask. And so you memorized words you didn't understand, repeated them in temples you didn't feel, and fell asleep under doctrines that rewrote your own memory. But there was once a prayer like no other, a prayer that didn't ask, a prayer that didn't plead, a prayer that commanded, not in arrogance, but in remembrance, not out of fear, but from alignment, a vibration so pure, so ancient, so encoded in your bones that wherever you spoke it, your spirit responded before your mind even recognized the words. That prayer didn't ask for miracles. It was the miracle. That's why it was erased. Not because it frightened some earthly authority. It frightened every authority that ever taught you to doubt your own heart. It was whispered in caves beneath mountains and sung under moonlight in deserts, always away from eyes that would kill to control it, ears that would twist it, tongues that would commercialize it. This prayer wasn't found on parchment or scroll. It was carried in blood memory, in rhythm, in breath. Its syllables didn't translate. They resonated. No grammar, no theology, just pure frequency, a hidden code that bypassed the intellect and triggered the spark of self beyond conditioning. When you felt it, you remembered. Not a doctrine, not a dogma, yourself. You remembered you are sovereign. You remembered there was never guilt except the guilt taught to you. You remembered your voice and your purpose before the script of separation was written inside your heart. Systems cannot abide that kind of remembering. Institutions built on obedience. And fear thrive when people forget their voice and fear their own power. So they buried the prayer, not with stones but with translations. They edited the phonetics. They rebranded the vibration as heresy. They banned specific sounds. They punished those who recited it. They rewrote holy texts to replace resonance with reason, frequency with formality, alignment with authority. They invented intermediaries, priests, scholars, authorities, anyone who would stand between you and your own connection. The ancient prayer made you sovereign. That sovereignty alarmed the empire, the temple, the throne. So they demolished its temples, burned its scrolls, silenced its singers, rewrote its syllables, until only the shell remained, and its power was lost. Yet sometimes, late at night, when your mind finally stills and the noise of the world recedes, you feel a vibration humming beneath your ribs, like a frequency you've forgotten, but which grieves to be silent no longer. You hear a tone inside your body, as a pulse, a memory in the form of a hum, and it stirs something ancient. That is not imagination. That is ancestral code stirring. That is the prayer calling you, and the moment it calls, you awaken. The moment you align with it, everything changes. Not outwardly at first, but inwardly, and the inward shift inevitably becomes outward. Picture this: a single word, a single tone, whispered correctly, could dissolve the programming that tells you you're broken. It could dismantle the narratives that taught you to obey each fear, each shame, each story that made you small. Because this prayer doesn't ask you to believe a story. It remembers the story before stories began. That's where true faith lives, not in belief, but in remembering. So when you speak it, quietly, intentionally, it activates the original instruction of your soul. It reactivates the divine blueprint. It realigns the fragments shattered by trauma, manipulation, shame. Systems fear it. Empires fear it. Religions fear it. They fear that one reclaimed soul can unmask the entire illusion. And here's the question burning under your skin. If such a prayer exists, hidden, erased, feared, why does your body still remember its shape? Why do the syllables still echo in bone and breath and memory? That is the secret door. That is the vulnerability of the system. That is why they erased it. Because when you remember it, they lose control. Before we continue, comment where you're watching this from, and make sure to like and subscribe if this already speaks to something inside you. They didn't just erase the prayer. They replaced it with noise. Not the kind you hear, but the kind you become. They flooded your mind with distractions so persistent that silence became unfamiliar, even frightening. They designed a world where your worth had to be proven, your voice had to be tamed, and your truth had to be filtered through approval. From your first breath, you were trained to forget. You were given a name before you knew what a name was. You were told what to believe before you could choose. You were rewarded for obedience and punished for intuition. And all the while, that ancient frequency, the one that once pulsed through every cell of your being, was being overwritten by scripts that made you compliant, fearful, busy. They didn't need to burn the prayer if they could bury it under layers of noise. They taught you how to survive, not how to remember. They gave you identity, but took your essence. And this is how the forgetting became tradition. The systems that did this to you didn't wear black robes or carry whips. They wore smiles. They offered diplomas, paychecks, praise. They built a world so perfectly inverted that truth looked like rebellion and healing felt like sin. You weren't told you were powerful. You were told you were problematic. Your sensitivity was pathologized. Your questions were disrespect. Your silence was weakness. And every time something inside you screamed, "This isn't right," you were taught to shame it, suppress it, medicate it. But what if that scream wasn't dysfunction? What if it was memory? The memory of a sound, the prayer, the real one, the one you never had to learn because your soul knew it before you were born. And what if all this chaos, all this conditioning, all this noise was designed not to protect you but to contain you? Because they knew. They always knew. One awakened voice can ripple through timelines. One realigned human can disrupt generations of programming. The prayer they erased didn't just heal wounds. It dismantled illusions. It reconfigured reality from the inside out. And they couldn't risk that. So they gave you a world where noise is praised and silence is punished. A world where being busy is noble and being still is lazy. A world where you doubt your own knowing. But the truth is, you were never lost. You were redirected, trained to fear your own frequency, conditioned to think. Remembering was madness. But somewhere deep inside the sound still lives. And now it's stirring again, quietly, powerfully, as if your bones themselves are humming the forgotten code. And once it begins to rise, nothing can stop it. They told you it was imagination, that the chills on your spine were random, that the lump in your throat during certain songs was just emotion, that the sudden tears during quiet moments were hormonal, irrational, nothing. They explained away the symptoms of awakening until you began to doubt your own senses. But those moments, the quiet flickers, the waves of feeling you couldn't trace, were never accidents. They were echoes, residual pulses of a frequency you were designed to carry, fragments of the ancient prayer vibrating through the cracks of your conditioning, trying to remind you of what was taken. You didn't forget it naturally. You were trained to forget. Layer after layer, each rule, each label, each moment you were told to behave, to sit, still, to be quiet, to stop crying, to stop dreaming. Each time you were mocked for feeling too much, thinking too deeply, or sensing things no one else noticed. That was the programming, not to destroy you, just to disconnect you. Because a disconnected soul is compliant, a disconnected soul is profitable, but a soul that remembers, that's a revolution waiting to happen. And the most effective prison is the one you don't see. So they didn't need bars. They gave you mirrors, distorted ones. Mirrors that only reflected what they wanted you to see. Achievements, appearance, productivity. They taught you to measure your worth by how well you performed inside the cage, not whether you remembered life beyond it. Every award, every compliment, every gold star was another link in the chain, and you smiled through it, because you were praised, because they said you were doing well. But what is well in a world built on forgetting? What is success when it costs your soul? No one told you that healing would feel like breaking, that remembering would feel like betrayal, that the first step to freedom would feel like loss, because you don't just leave the system, you leave the version of yourself that the system created. And that's terrifying, that's lonely, but it's also the only way back to the sound, the real sound, the one that speaks in resonance, not words, the one that reminds you not of what you believe, but of what you are. That's why they erased it, because it bypassed every lie. It bypassed language, ideology, belief. It couldn't be argued with or theologized. You didn't need a preacher to explain it or a scholar to validate it. When it hit you in the marrow. You didn't understand it. You remembered it. And that was the danger. Because remembering makes you unpredictable. Remembering makes you uncontrollable. Remembering collapses the entire narrative they've worked generations to build. They want you to think awakening is a light switch, on or off. But the truth is it's a rising tide, and it has already begun in you. You feel it when you try to go back to normal, and your body says no. You feel it when familiar things suddenly feel hollow, when people who once felt like home now feel like noise. That's not confusion, that's clarity. That's your frequency realigning with something ancient and alive, something deeper than memory, the architecture beneath your entire identity, the sound you were born from, and the sound they tried to erase. You never asked to forget. That's the part they never acknowledged, the violence of it, the subtle, daily, cumulative war against your own knowing. It didn't happen in a single moment, but in thousands of quiet ones. The teacher's disapproval when you asked the wrong question, the laugh from the room when you said what your heart felt, the sermon that told you doubt was sin, the diagnosis that called your intuition a disorder, and so little by little you started stepping away from yourself, just enough not to be too much, just enough to survive the room, just enough to avoid becoming the target. You didn't know that each of those moments was another layer over the sound, another line of static over the signal, and by the time you were old enough to choose, you were so far from your own frequency that silence felt like threat, stillness felt like suffocation, and yet something kept calling, something in your dreams, in your chest, in the tears you couldn't explain, in the music. That made you cry before the first lyric. That was the prayer, not gone, just waiting. It never abandoned you. It simply waited for your frequency to become quiet enough to hear again. Because the sound doesn't scream. It doesn't beg for your attention like the world does. It waits. It hums beneath the noise, pulsing with patience, holding space for the moment you'll stop running and sit down in the wreckage of your own silence. That's where it begins again. Not in the cathedral, not in the meditation app, but in the exact moment you finally stop pretending that you're okay. When you let the collapse happen, when you fall apart, not into darkness, but into truth. And in that free fall, something happens that no doctrine can explain. You start to feel the vibration return. You don't know why your skin tingles during certain words. You don't know why that strange chant makes your chest feel warm. But your body knows. Your bones know. You're not learning the prayer. You're recognizing it. It was never a set of words, it was a frequency. And it lived in you long before you were taught your name. They were terrified of that. Because when you remember the frequency, you begin to reverse the spell. You begin to see the system not as reality, but as architecture. A structure designed to keep you disconnected just enough to function, but not enough to awaken. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. You notice how everything is noise, how every song on the radio keeps you in one emotion, numbness, how every ad preys on your doubt, how every institution is designed to reward your forgetfulness, and worst of all, you see how you participated, how you helped build the cage from inside it. That's where the real grief lives. But that grief is sacred. That grief is your map home. Because the moment you grieve the false self is the moment the true one begins to return. Not as a concept, as a resonance, a sound beneath your skin, a vibration rising from the ashes of everything you thought you had to be. You never needed to be taught the truth, only reminded, because deep down, the architecture of your being was always aligned with it. Before the world named you, programmed you, dressed you in roles and rules, you existed in a raw, untamed frequency. That state before language, before shame, before the scripts, that was the real you. And that version of you still exists, not in some distant spiritual realm, but here, beneath the noise, beneath the wounds waiting. And the ancient prayer of the one they erased was never meant to be recited from a book. It was a sound that called that version of you back, not through effort, through resonance. It wasn't about asking for strength, it was about remembering you never lost it. It wasn't about asking for healing, it was about clearing the static so the original harmony could resurface. That's what terrified the system, not your rebellion. Your remembering. Because the moment you start to align with that frequency, the illusions start to dissolve. Fear begins to lose its grip. Shame becomes foreign. Authority becomes transparent. And suddenly, you see the game for what it is, a distraction from the only thing that ever mattered, your alignment with truth. But here's the part no one tells you. Remembering is painful, because the first thing it does is show you everywhere you abandoned yourself, every time you swallowed your voice, every time you said yes while your soul screamed no, every time you dimmed your light so someone else wouldn't feel insecure. The prayer reactivates all of it, not to punish you, but to bring it home, to integrate what was lost, to retrieve the fragments you left scattered across a lifetime of performing. That's why it hurts. That's why awakening feels like breaking. But it's not breaking. It's excavating, pulling away the layers of lies, compromises, and masks until you finally touch what's real. And when you do, even for a moment, everything changes. Not because the world outside shifts, but because you no longer need it to. You stop asking for permission. You stop chasing love through performance. You stop negotiating your value, because the frequency of the prayer recalibrates everything inside you. And suddenly the same world that once intimidated you begins to look different. You hear people speak, and you feel the hollowness behind their words. You walk into rooms and sense the tension hidden beneath smiles. You begin to notice how rare truth is, not because people are evil, but because they're afraid. Afraid of silence, afraid of their own resonance, afraid of what might rise if the noise ever stopped. That's why the prayer had to be hidden, not just by institutions, but by us. Because the truth it awakens requires everything, no more pretending, no more performing, no more half-truths, just to keep the peace. The prayer brings you into alignment with your original self, and that self doesn't compromise. It doesn't bow, it doesn't wait, it doesn't fear its own light. And when you start to embody that frequency, you don't just remember, you begin to transmit. And that's the beginning of a new reality. The transmission is not in your words, it's in your being. Once the frequency begins to return, you don't have to convince anyone of anything. Your presence itself becomes a disturbance to the system. Not because you're loud, but because you're clear. And clarity in a world built on confusion is dangerous. You walk into rooms and the energy shifts, not because you intend it, but because alignment speaks louder than performance ever could. People start to project onto you. They'll say you've changed, that you've become cold, distant, selfish. But that's not truth. That's what happens when someone refuses to play a role you never truly agreed to. The prayer you've remembered isn't about rebellion. It's about realignment. And realignment threatens every relationship, every identity, every contract you made when you were still pretending. It doesn't ask for destruction, it requires it. Not out of cruelty, but necessity. Because what is not in frequency cannot stay. Not friendships, not habits, not beliefs. And so begins the burning, the sacred dismantling, where the life you built on noise begins to crumble beneath the sound of who you really are. And this is where most people turn back, not because they don't feel the truth, but because they're afraid of what it will cost. And they're right. It costs everything false, every false smile, every false narrative, every false certainty. You will lose the version of yourself that fit neatly into the illusion, but you will gain something greater, something they never wanted you to have: coherence. The inner symmetry of a being that no longer splits itself in half just to be accepted. That is what the prayer activates. Not a moment of bliss, not an escape from pain, but a radical returning, a reconnection to your original instruction. And when that coherence takes root, your life becomes something else entirely. Not easier, but truer. You no longer chase purpose, you become it. You no longer seek love, you radiate it. You no longer fear endings because you finally understand the only things that end are the things that were never real. So when the system notices your frequency changing, it will respond. Subtly at first. Opportunities will dry up. Certain people will pull away. You'll be misunderstood, maybe even mocked. But that's how you'll know it's working. Because the system is built to reward noise and punish resonance. And the moment you stop performing the role it assigned you, it tries to cast you out. That's not failure. That's freedom. That's proof the old code is crumbling. The prayer didn't come to comfort you, it came to liberate you. And liberation is never quiet. It shakes foundations. It unearths everything buried. It rewrites timelines. And it does it not with force, but with frequency. That's how powerful the prayer is. That's why they deleted it. Because once one person remembers, they ripple, and the system cannot survive too many ripples. But the ripples have already begun. You are one of them, and soon others will remember too. Not because you told them, but because your frequency reminded theirs that they were never asleep, just waiting. There comes a point where the sound is no longer just inside you. It begins to echo through you. You feel it in your spine, in your breath, in the way you speak without thinking. And yet every word cuts through illusion like a blade. It's not performance, it's presence. And the presence that awakens from this ancient prayer cannot be manufactured. It is raw, radiant, unfiltered truth, and people can feel it. Some are drawn to it instantly, as if they've been starving for it. Others are repelled, triggered, even enraged, because your freedom exposes their chains. Not to shame them, but to remind them of what they've silenced in themselves. That's the paradox of remembrance. It liberates and destabilizes at the same time. Because when you walk in alignment, you become a mirror, not of who others pretend to be, but of what they've abandoned to survive. And the prayer, once reactivated, amplifies this, not as punishment, as invitation, to rise, to remember, to shed the roles and re-enter truth. But not everyone is ready to hear the sound. Many have built their entire lives around the absence of it. They call it stability. They call it logic. They call it success. But it's just silence dressed in gold. And when you begin to vibrate differently, the illusion they've depended on begins to tremble. And they blame you. Because it's easier than facing the truth, that they too once knew the sound, that they too once felt the frequency, as a child in a dream, in a heartbreak, in a moment of awe. But instead of following it, they buried it. Not because they were weak, but because the world told them it was dangerous, and they believed it. So now when your alignment appears, they don't see hope. They see the risk they never took, the self they never became. And that grief turns to defense. That defense turns to projection. And yet, you still stand. Not with anger, but with resonance. Because your prayer does not demand obedience, it offers remembrance. And that offering is the most radical thing in the world. It's not your job to convince them. The sound was never meant to be marketed or explained. It was meant to be felt. That's how it spreads. Through frequency, through embodiment, through the quiet, steady rhythm of someone who has remembered. And once remembered, the world begins to change. Not through revolution, through resonance. Because systems don't collapse through violence. They collapse when people stop believing in them. And belief is a frequency. It has a tone. And once that tone shifts, the scaffolding of the illusion begins to fall. Not all at once, but piece by piece, one choice at a time, one alignment at a time, one soul remembering at a time. And it all starts with the prayer they tried to delete, the one now rising through you, not as words, but as presence, not as doctrine, but as vibration. And with every breath you're transmitting it, to those who are ready to feel and to those who never stopped listening. You begin to notice it everywhere. Small, subtle signals that the frequency is returning. Not just in you, but in others. Strangers, locking eyes with recognition, as if some hidden part of them remembers a sound you've both never spoken but deeply know. Children humming tones they've never been taught. Artists creating things they can't explain. People waking up in the middle of the night with tears in their eyes and no idea why. The system calls it coincidence, but you know better. It's the prayer reactivating, like an ancient network coming back online. Not through force, through resonance. One soul remembering triggers another, and slowly the old world begins to tremble. The institutions start to feel hollow. The media begins to lose its grip. The fear no longer sticks the way it used to, because the frequency underneath is changing, and you are part of that change, not by preaching but by being. The sound moves through your breath, your choices, your silence. You become a signal, not a savior, just someone who remembered, and there's no going back. Not because you've renounced anything, but because you've outgrown it. The lies are too quiet now, the masks too heavy. You try to return to old roles, old conversations, old rhythms, but they crumble in your hands. And instead of panic, there's peace. Because what's dying is not your life, it's your prison. What's falling apart isn't your identity, it's your disguise. And in the space left behind, something sacred rises. Not new, original, untouched by doctrine, undistorted by language. It feels like remembering a song you've never heard, like breathing air that's been waiting for you. And you realize this is what they tried to erase. Not just the prayer, but the feeling, the coherence, the unbearable clarity of being fully aligned, of walking into a room and not shrinking, of loving without losing yourself, of choosing not from fear but from truth. That is the revolution, quiet, unstoppable, already underway. And the most miraculous part is this: you don't need to do anything to spread it. You just need to keep remembering, keep aligning, keep allowing the sound to rise in you and dissolve everything false. Because every time you choose resonance over reaction, truth over comfort, presence over performance, the system weakens. Not because you're fighting it, because you're outgrowing it. That's what they feared, that's why they buried the prayer, not because it caused rebellion, because it made rebellion unnecessary, because once people remember who they are, they stop asking for permission to exist. And a world of people like that, that's the end of control. That's the end of manipulation. That's the end of the illusion. And the beginning of something else. Something ancient. Something real. Something that was never lost. Only hidden. And now, finally, it's beginning to rise again. The sound is not coming. It's returning. And that's the difference. This isn't a new age or a new belief system being born. It's something older than time, reactivating inside of people who never truly forgot. People like you who feel things they can't explain, who walk through this world with the strange ache of something lost, not externally, but internally. A grief with no obvious source, a yearning that no career or relationship can satisfy. That ache is the sound trying to rise. That grief is your soul remembering what it was silenced from speaking. And when it finally does speak, not through language but through frequency, everything changes. Not just for you, but for everyone connected to you. Because when you remember, others remember. It's contagious, and it was always meant to be. That's why they had to erase it. Not because the prayer was too weak, but because it was too viral. Not spoken from pulpits, but felt through presence. Not spread through doctrine, but through coherence. And now it's rising again. Quietly, organically, beyond hashtags, beyond headlines. You see it in the breakdowns people can no longer avoid, in the shifts they can't explain, in the sudden longing for nature, for silence, for depth. People who once laughed at words like energy and alignment now weep in therapy rooms craving something real, and what they're craving, even if they don't know it, is the sound. The original one, the one before culture, before trauma, before guilt, the sound of coherence, of home. And when they hear it, not from a song, but from someone who carries it, they begin to unravel, gently, and then violently, because the soul doesn't awaken quietly. It ruptures, it grieves, it howls, and then it rises. And what rises in that moment is not a new belief, it's a memory, a recognition. The sound they were taught to fear now becomes the only thing that feels true. And this is the sacred convergence, the moment in time where everything buried begins to bloom. Not in temples, in living rooms, not through sermons, through presence, through pain, through people who were never meant to be leaders or prophets or saints, just whole. And in their wholeness, the sound returns. That's the real prophecy. Not that some savior would come from the sky, but that ordinary people would remember who they are and become extraordinary through frequency. And as more begin to align, the illusion begins to crack. The scripts lose power. The institutions become shells. Because nothing can stand against a being who remembers. No law, no label, no lie. And you, yes, you, are one of the ones remembering. You've felt it for a long time, haven't you? That quiet sense that something big is coming. It's not coming. It's arriving. Through you. Through all of us. Through the sound they couldn't kill. Only delay. You've crossed a threshold. And no matter how much the world tries to convince you otherwise, you know you can never return. Not to the roles. Not to the rhythm. Not to the version of yourself you wore like a uniform just to belong. It doesn't fit anymore. It feels like fiction, like theater, like someone else's skin. And now, everything you once called normal begins to dissolve in your hands. Conversations that used to energize you now fall flat. Crowds feel louder. Obligations feel heavier. The smile you used to wear like armor now feels dishonest. And underneath it all, something new, something ancient is rising. The frequency, the tone, the prayer. But now it's not a whisper in the background. It's your core, your axis, your alignment. And from that place, life begins to take on a different texture. You no longer chase, things begin to arrive. You no longer beg. What's meant for you recognizes you, because you're not vibrating lack anymore. You're broadcasting truth, and truth in this world is magnetic. People start to notice, even if they don't understand. Some lean in, unable to explain why they feel calm in your presence. Others recoil, threatened by your refusal to shrink. You stop being predictable, and the system hates that, because predictability is control. But you're not here to be manageable, you're here to be alive. And that aliveness begins to seep into everything. The way you eat, the way you speak, the way you say no without guilt, the way you hold space without needing to fix, save, or prove. You become quiet, not because you have nothing to say, but because silence now carries weight. You speak less, but when you do, people listen differently. It's not charisma, it's coherence. You're no longer fragmented. The different parts of you, heart, body, spirit, intuition, are finally speaking the same language. And that language is the frequency of the ancient prayer they tried to erase. It's not that your life suddenly becomes easy. On the contrary, things may fall apart. Relationships that thrived on your self-denial begin to decay. Jobs that demanded your obedience become unbearable. You find yourself grieving not just people but old versions of yourself. Versions who tolerated, who complied, who stayed quiet to keep the peace. But even in the grief, there is clarity, because now you understand that what's ending was never real. It was a performance. And what's emerging, though raw, though unpolished, is you, the true you, not the one shaped by survival, the one designed by frequency. That's the revolution they feared. That's the prayer's power. Not to change the world for you, but to change the world through you. Not in grand gestures, but in every small act of integrity, in every boundary you set, in every time you choose to pause instead of perform. That is the frequency. Living. You stop asking for signs. Because you are the sign. You stop waiting for divine timing. Because you realize, when you're aligned, timing becomes divine. Everything begins to synchronize, not because you're manifesting from ego, but because you've tuned your field. And a tuned field doesn't attract, it resonates. The right people find you, the right words emerge, the right paths open. Not because you control them, but because you remembered how to walk in your own current. That's what the prayer gave you. Not certainty, not comfort, but resonance. A return to the internal compass they tried to override with fear and rules. And now, with every breath, you walk as someone who carries the sound. You are no longer a seeker, you are a transmitter. And the signal you carry is not loud, but it is undeniable. And then it happens, not as a vision, not as a voice from the sky, but as something far more disruptive, a collapse within, sudden, silent, seismic, not of the world outside, but of the world inside, the false world, the one you built to survive, to be good, to be enough. It doesn't explode, it dissolves. You feel it in your chest, in your breath, in the space between your thoughts, like a storm breaking open from the center of your spine. And you don't know if you're dying or being born because it feels like both. The tears come, not as sadness, but as surrender, a letting go so deep it has no words. You fall to your knees, not in prayer, but in presence. And something inside you whispers, not in language, but in frequency. You are free, not because you've escaped, but because you've stopped running. Because for the first time in your life, you are not trying to be anything. You're just here, bare, true, unfolded, and it is enough. The pain isn't gone, but it no longer owns you. The fear still flickers, but it no longer drives you. The past still echoes, but it no longer defines you. You see it all now, not through the lens of shame, but with the clarity of truth. Every mistake, every detour, every time you betrayed yourself to be loved. It's all here, but now it belongs to you. Not as burden, but as memory, sacred memory. Because even in your forgetting, The sound never left you. Even in your silence, the prayer kept humming beneath the noise. And now, for the first time, you don't have to search for it. It's in you, it always was. You weren't lost. You were layered, covered, programmed, but never broken. That's the part that shatters you, the realization that you spent your entire life trying to become something you already were, trying to earn what you are, and that truth breaks something open inside you that will never close again. You sit in the wreckage of what you used to be and feel nothing but peace, not because everything is resolved, but because everything is real. You no longer need the answers. You are no longer seeking to arrive. You are here, breathing, vibrating, remembering, and it is holy, not in the way you were taught, but in the way that feels cellular. You feel like a song the earth is singing through your skin, like the universe has stopped holding its breath because you finally returned. And as you rise, not in triumph, but in stillness, you realize you are the prayer, not the words, not the sound, the vessel, the transmission, the living bridge between what was forgotten and what is being remembered. And that remembering does not need an audience. It doesn't need a stage. It happens in the way you make tea, the way you hold someone's gaze, the way you breathe into grief without running. This is the real awakening. Quiet, soft, unstoppable. Is this story resonating with you? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now let's continue. You won't need to speak of this to everyone. Some things are too sacred for explanation, too intimate for language. The shift you've undergone isn't meant to be broadcast. It's meant to be embodied, because now the prayer lives through you, in the choices no one sees, in the kindness that expects nothing, in the boundaries you hold not to punish but to protect what's true. You walk differently now, not with arrogance, but with gravity, with the silent authority of someone who no longer seeks validation, not because they have all the answers, but because they're finally asking the right questions. And the most important of them all is not what's next or what should I do? It's this: how do I stay in this frequency? Not perfectly, not always, but consciously, deliberately, because the world will try to pull you back, into roles, into stories, into noise. But now you know you don't have to go. You can stay here, in presence, in remembrance, in resonance. That's what changes the world. Not outrage, not debate, but people like you who choose every day to return to their own alignment, who wake up and breathe not just air, but intention, who walk into rooms and recalibrate the atmosphere just by being coherent. No one will give you a medal for it. No one will make a movie about your quiet revolution, but someone will feel it, a child, a stranger, a soul on the edge of forgetting. And in that moment, they'll remember something too, not because you told them, because you carried it. That's the legacy. That's the power. That's the prayer, still speaking, not from history, but from you. And as you move forward, don't rush to understand. Let it unfold. Let it guide. Let it hum inside your bones. Because you were never meant to save the world. You were meant to remember who you are, and in doing so, help the world remember itself. Have you ever done something kind that changed a life forever? Tell me in the comments. And if this story made you feel something, share it with someone who needs to remember who they are.